folks are out, but that really is only 3 or 4 people from the normal class, so we'll see if everybody, we've had such high attendance, we'll see if people
Such a
trickle
nice
in.
day, maybe people are playing hooky.
Yeah, maybe people decided to skip and enjoy the nice day. Well, we'll begin with what I handed out, or they're over there if you missed it coming in. John Robinson's farewell sermon, and we'll talk more about Robinson today, but he was the pastor of the Plymouth, or of the Pilgrim congregation, and this is what we have recorded of the sermon that he delivered before they got on the boat there in Leyden, or not in Leyden, it's in, it's the town that starts with a D.
I'm sorry, what?
Town that starts with a D,
Dresden?
not Dresden.
Dort.
Delft or?
Delft.
Delft, it's Delft. Delft is where I think they got on the boat. Leyden's where they lived, they got on the boat in Delft. But this was Edward Winslow recording the sermon. So take a moment and look at this. We like to quote from, we even have a hymn in our hymnal that draws from this sermon. But see what stands out to you, and then two things. My second question is going to be what maybe still inspires us today in the sermon. But the opening, my first question is, do you see in there any of the connections to the theological context we've discussed the last couple of weeks, which I have summarized on the board here in case you don't read this. While you're still looking at the beginning, talks about the great work of plantation. Of course, they weren't building southern slave plantations, which is how we think of the term now. Recently, when we were doing the Lord's Prayer, I swear Sebastian said, "And lead us not into plantation." And I thought that kind of works too. Well, there in about the middle part of it, he starts talking about the other Reformation churches and where they're flawed. And
This sentence, but whether the Lord has appointed it or not, is that having to do with whether people believed in predestination or not?
pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
So he's a little more ambiguous on that, so that's something to note about Robinson. So.
As for example, the Lutherans, they could not be drawn to go beyond what Luther saw.
I like the Calvinists, they stick where he left them. A misery much to be lamented. I would agree. The Robinson himself would have been considered a Calvinist.
Brownist.
Yes, so the Brownists. So we talked about Robert Brown, the first of the English separatists, and about how the Pilgrims would eventually distance themselves as not being Brownists. So here's an example of him distancing themselves.
Religion, oh yes.
But I'm curious, well, why is Brownist to be disparaged as a mere nickname and brand? He doesn't do the same with either Lutheran or Calvinist, about which presumably the same.
But I think because, like I said, the reason they ended up disliking Robert Brown is though he started the first independent congregation, he eventually recanted and went back to the Church of England. And he was just such an unpleasant fellow. That all the historians record that he beat his wife, show that they clearly, he was just, he was not a nice guy. There's also something a little interesting near the end. And so advised us all by means to endeavor to closely with the godly party of the kingdom of England, and rather to study union than division, that has to do with a debate of, well, there's still some good God-fearing people in the Church of England. Not everybody is separated. And the separatists had this debate. Should they associate with the good people left in the Church of England or not? And Robinson ends up being of the party, yes, we should. So he's not as doctrinaire separatist as some of the others.
What does he mean by close with them? He might possibly, without sin, close with them to the least major.
I think he means kind of
Get
draw
away,
back together.
but not make a big issue of it. I guess.
yeah. And part of that may be practical, we'll get to later, is that of course they needed sanction in order to go settle in New England. So
Is it surprising that they got that at all?
not completely. We'll get to that point near the end. So so anything in this still inspired. So that shows some connections to the context we've looked at the last 2 weeks. But anything in here still kind of inspired you?
Well, it seems not, I guess it surprises me in a way that this is a sermon preached to separatists, and yet the way it ends seems anything but separatist.
Yeah, he seems to have is kind of moving back.
It almost, well, I don't know what all is going on here, but it seems to almost undercut the argument for separatism. If you could have a pastor who's otherwise minded, well, having two separatists is not a problem.
They never did rejoin the Church of England that way.
Yeah. And he never made the trip either.
He never made the trip, died before he could, so. Well, the line that we quote all the time anymore is, I had it a second ago. It's up near the top of the second paragraph. For he was very confident the Lord had more truth and light yet to break forth out of his holy word, which in many ways was considered the justification for the God is still speaking campaign. That,
Yeah.
since our founding pastor said God still has truths to reveal to
Something
us.
to say.
And his kind of idea is like when you get to New England, you'll be in a new context, new things. Don't feel trapped to do things just the way everybody else has done them. Feel free to listen and discern and go in new directions, which of course we did. So got a whole lot more liberal than the context over there, at least over the last 4 centuries. Well, to just review, so the first day we talked about the English context, kind of the history of the Reformation and the Church of England, who the Puritans were, who the Separatists were. Then last week we talked about the European context. That one was more a narrative. This was kind of 3 separate chunks. First, kind of the Reformed tradition, particularly the French Huguenots that influenced the congregation. Then the more radical reformers, particularly the Anabaptists, who they interacted with some and who had some influence, particularly through the Dutch Mennonites. And then what the context was in Holland when they moved there, these even violent arguments between different versions of predestination. Anyone use supralapsarian or infralapsarian in conversation this week? Actually, Fred and I did, but more just joking about it, really. And then the Arminians who believed in free will, more in free will and against the predestination. And then the hardcore Calvinists kind of won out in the end. So then today we'll focus on just that congregation and how it develops and its leaders and its history until it kind of gets to America. Then we'll talk a little bit about its legacy and all at the end. And I think we'll leave mostly more focus on that for later forums as we get to that. So,
Is there a 4th session, Scott, or is this
no,
the
this is
final
it.
one?
This is the final one. So, Nottinghamshire. I couldn't get the map to lay down too well, but in the book. So
Is
this,
that Robin Hood country?
it is Robin Hood Company. There's Sherwood Forest. So,
Oh, yeah.
so Nottingham itself is 25 miles that way. So it's at the northern edge of the county because there's Yorkshire, and across the river here is Lincolnshire. this all indicates kind of wetlands. It was in a kind of tidal rivers. So Gainsborough, though inland, was still a port. You could go down the river Trent out to the sea. So this is the area in which the core group of the Pilgrims in this congregation arose. And if you're at all curious tonight, more of the kind of history and context and all of what, this book that I mentioned, the Making Haste from Babylon, goes into a great detail of kind of discussing the history of this county, the key figures, the backgrounds of the families involved, and as much as we can from records. And of course the English kept pretty good record, you know, as long as things didn't flood or burn. There's still lots of great records from throughout English history that you can trace. And see in what ways the context may have affected these particular folks. So let's see, what does Bunker say? The men who led the Plymouth colony came from a precise, distinctive zone with special tensions, limits, and possibilities that shaped their upbringing and their attitudes. They came from a place where the land carries many meanings, inscribed by glaciers, by floodwaters, by politics, and by religion. So this had a reputation of being unruly country, going back even to Robin Hood times. Right? It was cow country, grazing on the grasses, particularly of the wetlands. There a great deal of trade occurred along this route. This line here is the Great North Road, 140 miles to London, and then that would have gone on up to Scotland. So any of the times, you know, you would have had English armies marching up to attack the Scots, they would have come through. This was on a main, you know, transportation and trade route. You're not in some hinterlands or something. So these people would have had been connected to what was going on in English history. The wetlands, of course, could also propagate disease. There were 6 epidemics between 1587 and 1610. So in the time here in which congregation would have been forming and people growing up, they would have been lucky to survive. The county also had a higher number of bastards than most counties, which suggests some licentiousness. Interesting that English even kept records such as that, right? So it was not necessarily the most God-fearing of places. And so if you were a God-fearing person, you're kind of a little countercultural to begin with. How could such a society fail to cause strife, conflict, and sin? And how could people be godly if they were poor, illiterate, and bullied by godless superiors? The social evils caused by poverty were all too obvious in the quadrilateral, that's what he calls this. So too were the startling flaws of the men set above the population in positions of authority. The Mayflower story is the record of the extraordinary manner in which a group of people broke out of confining limits. So one of the things I pointed out before is that most of the people on the Mayflower were not poor. They were not the lowest class. Nor were they the upper class. They came from either the lowest level of the country gentry or the highest level of the yeomen who were kind of working to become gentlemen. And so they hung kind of precariously on that point in the ladder. Because if you're at the lowest level of being a gentleman, you know, it takes one disaster and then you would descend socially. You weren't quite as firm as someone a little higher up.
They would have had to pay quite a bit to be on this voyage in the first place, and they would have had to have funds to establish themselves in the new world.
They needed their own funds and they also had to fundraise.
Yeah, right.
Which is, because about half the people on the boat ended up not being members of the congregation, who were other people who came to America, and that helped fund the establishing of the colony, and led to some tensions, of course, on the boat later.
How many people were on that boat?
Oh goodness,
Jesus.
100 and so.
yeah, I think that's, yeah. And I forget how many survived the winter.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, I've known all that at different points, but it's not in my head for today, so. So let's talk about William Brewster. William Brewster was a layman, the lay elder of the congregation, but one of the key organizers, and kind of his story helps us to understand a little bit of the context in Nottinghamshire, and then how you might develop along the way that he did. And he was in his 50s when he came to the United States, or came to America, which would have been, you know, a little older than most of the folks. And now, as I had mentioned last week, Brewster was actually a well-connected person. He had served on the staff of the Secretary of State, who was William Davison. He had gone with him to Holland when the English sent troops to aid the Dutch Protestants in overthrowing the Spanish Habsburgs. So he had been a part of the English diplomatic corps, and when he came back home to Nottinghamshire, he was the postmaster of the town of Scrooby. And to be postmaster would have meant you also were the person in charge of making sure the horses were all there and ready to like keep ferrying the mail up or down along the road. But it was a government appointment. It would have made him kind of a low-level gentleman. His father had a reputation for lechery, even though he was the bailiff for the archbishop. And his father had a history of suing people for libel if they accused him of lechery, but they were probably legitimate. So Brewster seems very different from his father, because history records Brewster as a very pious and upstanding human being. Bunker writes, how did William Brewster become the man he was? Or to put it another way, what was he trying to achieve, first as a separatist and then as an American? And why did he want to achieve it? The answer may run something like this. When the Pilgrims settled in the New World, they were looking for more than Christian liberty, however they might define it. They carried with them a blended ideology, an amalgam between religious beliefs and secular concepts of virtue, gentility, and heroism. These ideas were borrowed from ancient Greece and Rome and then refashioned to suit the needs of the Elizabethan era. Brewster, as we shall see, became exposed in his teens and 20s to new thinking about what it meant to be civilized and courageous. Welded together with Calvinism, it gave him a powerful creed, a Puritan compound of St. Paul and the stoic austerity of Roman heroes. Life in Nottinghamshire was unheroic and unholy. For a man of William Brewster's social rank, it also contained barriers to advancement. Puritanism offered perhaps an alternative, the opportunity and the means to escape from what he thought of as moral squalor. It might also provide a new way to define gentility and virtue, words that resonated widely in the discourse of the period. So interesting, so some sense of both religious and kind of personal, intellectual adventure, desire to do something completely new.
Perhaps his father's character was a springboard for him to go in a better direction.
Seems like it. So that's Brewster.
Would that have been very old in that culture?
Yeah, and he lived longer than any of the other people.
But he was old to start with. When
Of the four original people that founded the congregation in Nottinghamshire, he's the only one that ended up in America and the one that lived the longest, which is interesting. So he must have been some hardy stock given how many people did die. So here's another one of the founders of the original congregation who you might not know because John Smith doesn't make it to America, and his story goes in a different direction. This quote, a visible communion of saints is of 2, 3, or more saints joined together by covenant with God and themselves, freely to use all the holy things of God according to the word for their mutual edification and God's glory. So that sounds like some of the earlier separatists we'd heard about before. So John Smith, as with many of these more radical English figures, went to Cambridge, and there they soaked in more radical ideas from their professors. He became a fellow, so a member of the faculty in 1593, but faculty of Cambridge didn't make much money back in that day, so you used that as a springboard to something else. So in 1600, he became the city lecturer in Lincoln, so just off the map there earlier. So cities would have hired people to come and give, religious lectures. So he wasn't pastor of a local parish, but had this kind of civic function. But then he got fired only 2 years later for his non-conforming views. The next year, the Archbishop revoked his license to preach. He moved to the city of Gainsborough, which was on the map, the biggest city in that map, where he decided to practice medicine. I guess you could do that without training. But then the Archbishop, who also could license that, revoked his license from that. The Archbishop clearly did not like it. The Archbishop of York clearly didn't like John Smith, since he kept taking away his ability to have a living. So,
What does saint mean?
Saint.
that's saying, it's just a different spelling. So
Okay.
I left these in the
That's
spellings
interesting.
that they're
That's
originally
interesting,
written
yeah.
in.
All with no.
So by 1607, he had decided to break completely with the Church of England, and he was the founding pastor of the congregation as it formed initially in Gainsborough. So now there will eventually become 2 congregations, but originally all of the radical separatists in the region founded a church at Gainsborough, and he was elected the original pastor. And we get some recorded history of this. John Robinson actually wrote this account. So, Mr. Smith and Mr. Helwas, who we'll get to in a minute. Oh wait, that's the wrong quote. That's the wrong quote. All right. That comes later. Well, maybe I've lost the quote I'm not there. Sorry about that. Okay. We'll come back to that. Make sure I have that one later when I do. Okay. So now John Robinson, whose farewell sermon we read. He also went to Cambridge, soaked up the same radical politics, became a member in theology, became a member of the faculty in 1598. Then in 1604 was hired as the associate minister in Norwich. By a year later, he had lost his license to preach because of his non-conforming views. And then by 1607, he also then was in Nottinghamshire and a part of this founding congregation. So what seems to have happened, although because it was an underground church, we don't get a lot of details from the time period as to what happened. And a lot of them didn't write too much in detail later. They just kind of wrote the basics. But it seems to be that in around 1606, all of these figures that were there and around the city of Gainsborough began to find each other. They formed this underground church group meeting. By 1607, it constituted themselves as a church, elected Smith as the pastor, and it grew too large to be in hiding. And so since Robinson was also a trained minister, Robinson took some of the congregation and they began to meet at Scrooby Manor, which is pictured in the... So that is the kind of the origin of the Pilgrim congregation, is the folks who in 1607 began to meet in Scrooby Manor for their church. So they were all considered one congregation, but that it kind of had 2 satellites. But of course, over time, because you're in 2 different meeting places and 2 different pastors, you're going to begin to develop a little differently. And so even from 1607, we know William Brewster was the lay elder of that congregation. William Bradford, who'd later be the governor of Plymouth Colony, was a teenager attending that worship service. So a lot of the folks who will end up and maybe John, I don't think John Hallam, my ancestor, was involved, but the Carvers, I forget which congregation the Carvers were involved. The original governor of the colony was Carver, and John Hallam was his indentured servant. So, but a lot of those key people in what will be the founding of Plymouth Colony are already involved in 1607.
I'm sorry, it's interesting that Robinson and Smith have the shared history of their license to preach be revoked. And at least 2
two of the four original have that common ground.
They do, yeah. So it seems that in maybe March 1607 is when the key break occurred. And here's some description of their worship. One led by Smith at Gainsborough, while the other was convened at Scrooby Manor by Clifton, Robinson, and Brewster. 2 letters survive, one by Thomas Helmus, that give us some idea of their style of worship. It was an all-day exercise, so let me know if you want to return to this. Beginning at 8 in the morning and ending at 5 or 6 in the evening. In 2 sessions, divided by a 2-hour break at noon, they sang psalms, but most of all, they worshipped by prophesying, reading a biblical text,
Okay.
with each participant standing up to discuss it. A radicalized version of the Swiss practice invented many decades earlier and advocated by Robert Brown.
Wow.
So a real focus on the priesthood of believers, in the sense that though you had preachers, there were
You still had a chance to voice your own.
everybody.
Mhm.
What do you think? Should I try a worship service like that?
That's remarkable. That, I've heard of long church services, but.
That's rather long.
That's
yeah.
right, yeah.
But if you were doing it in hiding and, probably took advantage of.
Might as well get your money's worth while you're there.
So we have this quote from William Radford talking about that time period. They shook off this yoke of anti-Christian bondage, and as the Lord's free people join themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate in the fellowship of the gospel, to walk in all his ways, made known or to be made known, and to them, according to their best endeavors, whatsoever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. That's a painting. It's later someone did. Of course, I translated from the Middle English to the.
So a question that I would have though about that church structure would be, as a separatist group, they're trying to coalesce under a common belief and practice. Is that practice itself truly expressing an individual view of interpretation, or is it that they are each standing and professing alignment with the group's perspective?
I don't know. I mean, there'd be some social pressure. They did have this sense of kind of discipline if you got out of hand. Right?
Yeah.
But it's one of those interesting things, and it was something I was highlighting last week. Even when they had kind of hardcore theology, there clearly were these like seeds planted around individual thought and more radical ideas and everything. And those seeds clearly germinated in American soil. And for the next few centuries, they debated hardcore theology or these more kind of radical ideas. So yeah, even if people are standing up saying the same sorts of things, clearly this is going to empower individual freedom of expression in a way that attending the Church of England would.
I see women in the picture, but it makes me wonder, were women part of the original worshiping congregation?
I think the answer to that is yes. Now, I don't know whether the women stood up and talked to her.
Right, yeah.
My guess is not.
Do you know how many of them were married?
No, I don't. You could figure that out, but I don't know.
Yeah.
That. No, I don't.
Because the compact only shows male people,
Yeah, only the men signed that.
but you can't tell if they have that spouse or not.
Many of them were, but not all of them were.
Were there children?
There were children,
There
yeah.
were, yeah.
And the 4 unaccompanied children. That was a Guardian article recently. We saw that one. So 4 children who basically been sold into servanthood that came on the boat. 3 of them died. So about this time, there was a new Bishop of York, Toby Matthew. The previous Archbishop of York had been a little more tolerant, but Toby Matthew was not, and he began to prosecute dissenters, mostly Catholics. The records show that 80 or 90% of those he prosecuted were Catholics worshiping in hiding, but he began to go after the more radical Protestants as well. And what seems to have been the problem that they had with the separatist congregation, was not its theology, because at least the governing theology of the Church of England at this point was a little more Calvinist, or at least open to the theology that the Pilgrims had. The issue was that it represented political dissent by wanting to be separate from the state church, not acknowledging the king as the head of the church, that it was a political problem and not a theological problem. So shortly after the congregation formed, members of the church began to be arrested, including some of the women. Mrs. Carver was one of them, and hauled before the court that considered such things. People spent some time in jail. They were fined, and then others went into hiding. So even in a small county like that, so William Brewster and some of the others had warrants for their arrest, but avoided arrest. And so even by the fall of 1607 was the first time they tried to flee to Holland, and they were unable to do so. So at that time in England, one needed permission in order to leave the country. You couldn't just up and leave on your own. So it's technically an illegal act to try to leave the country. So let's get the fourth leader of the congregation, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the flight. So Thomas Helwys, also someone whose name you probably don't know because he ended up not going to America, and his story went in a different direction. But he was the lay elder of the Gainsborough Church. So the two pastors were Smith and Robinson, and the two lay elders were Brewster and Helwys. Helwys was the wealthiest of the members of the congregation. His grandfather had built up an estate just through leasing land and then farming cattle on it, but had developed a sizable amount of wealth. His father then had become a gentleman, technically, and a Calvinist, and sent Thomas off to train in London as a lawyer. But for whatever reason, Helwys came home and farmed instead of practicing as a lawyer. And it was Helwys who organized the flight from England to Holland. He's the one that arranged the ship and how they were all going to get there. He had the monetary resources and the connections to do that. So he's a key person in the Pilgrim history that many people don't know about. This quote comes from much later. Helwys is important in the Baptist story, and growing up as a Baptist, this was one of the quotes we were proud of. For men's religion to God is between God and themselves. The king shall not answer for it. Neither may the king be judged between God and man. Let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatsoever. It appertains not to the earthly power to punish them in the least measure. This is made evident to our Lord the King by the Scriptures. Which was the first time, at least in English writing, and maybe even in all of European writing, that someone advocated religious liberty to Muslims. So, and to heretics. Usually religious liberty was to other Christians, and maybe occasionally to Jews. But Helwys seems to be the first that argued that regardless of your religious beliefs, you were free to believe, and the king shouldn't do anything for you. So. Okay, so in 1608, they finally attempt to flee. About 100 people. Some went on different boats, but the big mass was 100 people. If you read this story, it reads like an adventure story. They got on the boat at various points coming down the river, hiding. And unfortunately, before they got to the sea, the boat ran aground in the mud flats. They got stuck. They all got arrested. And so here and so you see the soldiers coming across the mud flats to get them. So then the town outside of which they got stuck now has 100 men, women, and children, normal, ordinary people, not your, typical sort of criminals now that they've got to try to figure out what to do with them. And clear records do not exist, but they end up being let go and go on to Holland. So what seems to be the supposition is that when the local authorities appealed up to what we should do about it, that Robert Cecil, who was the kind of the key, not prime minister, but the key figure at that time, had larger fish to fry, bigger issues going on, that the state didn't need to be concerned about 100 of these, and that maybe, in fact, letting them go would be more beneficial.
Have to feed 'em.
So, because there had been some lawyers wanting to represent the more radical groups and try to win some points in the courts, and it seems like Cecil decided we don't really need a court case of someone representing all these men, women, and children. Let's just let them go. No one knows that for sure. That's not recorded anywhere, but that seems to be a best guess. So they finally board a ship and get to Holland. So in 1609, they get to they all kind of finally are there and beginning to settle down. And they originally lived kind of in this multicultural mix of Mennonites, other separatists. On the first Sunday, we talked about there, even back to 1593, there'd already been groups that had left and moved to Holland. They originally lived associated with Francis Johnson's church. We mentioned him the first day. And that church is the one that had all sorts of controversies, including the controversy over the pastor's wife sleeping in until 9 a.m.
Oh, dear.
For which people got excommunicated because of their views. So they were originally a part of that congregation. But then almost immediately, in 1609, Smith and Helwys and their followers from Gainsborough become Baptists. So that we do have recorded by John Robinson, who seems to have been present but didn't participate. Mr. Smith, Mr. Helwys, the rest having utterly dissolved and disclaimed their former church, state, and ministry, came together to erect a new church by baptism, under which they also ascribed so great virtue, so that they would not so much as pray together before they had it. And after some straining of courtesy, who should begin? Mr. Smith baptized first himself, and next Mr. Helwys, and so the rest, making their particular confessions. So it seems that once they got to Holland and then interacted with the Mennonites and some of these other more radical groups, that at least John Smith became convinced that of the points that we made last week of Balthasar Hubmaier and some of that baptism should only belong to believers, and that a true church was made up by adults who had freely chosen to be in the church. So last week we mentioned Balthasar Hubmeier's congregation in Germany was the first one that dissolved as a church, and then they baptized themselves, they reformed as a church and elected him the pastor. And it seems now that something similar happened with John Smith's, at least his group in the congregation. So this is where the congregation that had been one but met in two places, almost immediately they get to Holland, be split into two groups. The radical act is that Smith had no one else baptize him. He baptized himself, which may be the most radical act in the, And then almost immediately after that, John Robinson and his group moved to Leyden instead of staying in Amsterdam. So this is the definitive split in this congregation that then goes off in two different directions, both of which end up with great impact on the history of the world. Smith, very soon after that, began to regret that he baptized himself, decided that that wasn't legitimate, and so he asked the Mennonites to baptize him, which they did, but they didn't let him join the church. They were not so sure about this guy. And in fact, they never let him join the church. He actually died then, technically not a member of any congregation. When he did that, Thomas Helwys was not interested in becoming a Mennonite and not interested in going through all this yet again. And so 10 members of the congregation stayed with Thomas Helwys. They then become Arminians, so they give up their Calvinism, become supporters of free will, and begin to preach against predestination. In 1611, Helwys decides to lead the group back to England. They settle in London. He seems to be of the opinion that radicals should not all flee, that if you all flee, then you don't change the society you're from. So he decides to go back, despite all the dangers that that might create. The next year, he published his Defense of Religious Liberty, the quote that I read a minute ago. He wanted to personally give a copy to King James, because I guess he has some guts, and wasn't able to do that, but he did send a copy to King James. He, of course, was almost immediately arrested, thrown into Newgate Prison, where he died in 1616. But that group of 10 people, they came back to Thomas, and it began the English Baptist movement. Within a quarter century, there were 50 Baptist congregations, and then the rest of Baptist history goes from there. Where it's influential ultimately in our congregation is, of course, a few decades later when Roger Williams is in his battle with the Puritans in Boston. Williams, of course, becomes a Baptist influenced by these same ideas and takes a core of the colony and moves to Rhode Island and establishes the first Baptist church in America, and the Rhode Island colony, and established on separation of church and state and religious liberty, and then goes on to affect the American history. So even though our particular branch of the congregation didn't go in this direction, they had these deep ties to that, and those ideas continued to permeate. Any questions about?
I have a question.
Yeah.
When they went to Holland, was that originally their final destination? They weren't planning to go anywhere else at that point, or were they just trying to get out of England and put together their voyage?
I don't know.
Yeah.
There were, all through this period, people had to move from one country to another as the climate became more accommodating in one place. So I don't think any of them really thought they were permanent anywhere.
I
right?
see.
So, and if things in England changed, they would have gone back there, been more accommodating. But things that, what we said the first week is, things were okay under Elizabeth, even though she persecuted the radicals, but they got really bad under King James, because he actively persecuted them. So who knows if that were, their history wasn't that sort of stuff would change from one decade to the next. So. So Robinson's group ends up in Leyden. So now one congregation has ended up as 3 different groups, but this core group from Scrooby Manor all stays together. So they get to Leyden, and one of the things that really begins to shock them of their experience in London is, like, of course they get to the Holland and they don't have farms, they don't have their jobs and appointments. So they just have to become, like most immigrants do, physical laborers, doing, really awful work that no one else wants to do. This doesn't change, right? Work that's kind of beneath their social status and not what they were used to. So they had to really struggle to make it. They decided that one way to try to make some money and get ahead is they opened a printing press, and so they founded the Pilgrim Press, which is now our denomination. It's not that it existed without break for 400 years. But, and they printed dissenting books, and they smuggled them back into England, which of course also didn't endear them to the authorities very much. They were kind of engaged in the religious debates that were going on in Leyden at the time between the hardcore Calvinists and the more liberal Arminians. obviously the Helvis group went one direction. The Robinson group stayed Calvinist, although you can see from this sermon, not quite as hardcore as some of the others. And of course, you've all heard the story that they began to dislike the fact that the kids were all learning Dutch and not English. And that's part of the story we all learn, which is true. And there's always a risk of further oppression there in Holland. Given the violence of the religious debates going on, they're worried maybe a side will win that's not conducive to having us here. You know, it's never good to be an immigrant in a chaotic, volatile society. The Spanish Catholics were still trying to retake the country, and had that happened, they obviously would not have been welcome or safe. So they begin to think about what to do. And so America opens itself up as this possibility to go and create something new. So they begin to develop the plans to sail. Now that needed royal permission and it needed funding. So maybe that's one reason this congregation became a little bit more moderate in their separatism and their ideas. Maybe some of it was out of practicality. They begin to emphasize that they fit within traditional Reformed thinking, that they were an Orthodox group. They were not as radical as these Baptists or these other groups. Right? They emphasized their connection to the French Huguenots, the people we looked at early last week, and that their ideas were just within that kind of traditional way of thinking. And so with that, and with some of their connections, they are able to secure some funding. Bunker's book goes a whole lot into the economics of that and who the funders were and how many of the investors lost everything by supporting this group. But the ones that stuck with it turned out okay in the end. But it took 10 years before it made any money. But the colony was a for-profit exercise. It was not just a noble experiment. They had to turn a profit, but it took them a decade to. And again, it seems to be that maybe the English court just was okay to be rid of them. Like, yeah, they're over there in Holland, but they're still publishing books, and they're still like, let's just get rid of it. Plus, the English were wanting to establish colonies in New England, and not a lot of people were wanting to go do that. And so, in the same way that they later sent, prisoners to Australia, let's just send the people we don't want. And they had to have known casualty rates would be high and everything. So it seems like, on some level, the English court just sent them. So in 1620, of course, a group of them sailed. John Robinson stays, and he's the actual, which means they sailed without a pastor. So most of the early years of the colony, there's no pastor. So William Brewster, as the lay elder, was the head of the congregation. In fact, at one point, the investors sent a pastor, and they didn't like the guy. And they eventually ran him off. It also seems that the guy that the investors sent had been a Puritan pastor up in what would now be Northern Ireland. And it seems that he lost his parish up there because he had a little bit too much interest in the women of the parish. So this was a disgraced minister who had nowhere to go, and so that's why he ended up
They send him over.
So let's send him over. So there's a good reason. William Brewster would not have been inclined to have such a person suddenly step in as the pastor of the congregation. So the Pilgrims eventually ran him. But there's debates in the history books and even the people writing at the time whether that guy got a fair shake or not. So John Robinson stayed. One of the interesting things that Barbara Zickman points out in her UCC history is that John Robinson's particular group of the congregation never had a schism. All these other groups broke apart. The original group from Scrooby Manor, 1607, never broke up. Other than the fact that some went to America and some stayed in Leyden. They never had a major controversy. They never had a sharp theological break up with one another. And she credits that to John Robinson, who all historical records seem like a good person, a good pastor, a kind person. In 1619, he wrote a book entitled A Just and Necessary Apology to defend the views of his congregation. And here's what some of those views are. Baptism should be limited to the children of committed church members. That Sunday is the only holy day Christians are commanded to observe. Remember, they didn't observe Christmas. Marriage is a civil matter, not a right of the church. That prophecy or preaching is a gift not limited to the clergy, but one that may be exercised by any member of the community of faith. And that certain things indifferent are non-essential to faith and practice. So let's not strain over hairs that are not all that important to who we are. So you can see in there at least some sense of more liberalizing, open ideas that we have. Although there is this, I'm glad Deb's not here to. By the people whose liberty and right in voting we thus avow and stand for in matters truly public and ecclesiastical, we do not understand, as it hath pleased some contumenously to upbraid us, women and children, but only men, and them grown and of discretion, making account that as children by their non-age, so women by their sex are debarred of the use of authority in the church. So he has that mark against him.
When did that change?
The 1800s. Oh, but I do, okay, so here's an interesting point. I should have, so in that original Baptist congregation of Thomas Ellis's in London, women were ordained deacons in that congregation. So Baptist, at least, this was always interesting when growing up as Southern Baptist, we were debating the ordination of women, is that the history books were very clear that we had done it in the 1600s, and so why couldn't we do it in the 1900s? So, they get to America. Here's William Bradford. They knew they were pilgrims and looked not much on these things, but lifted up their eyes to heaven, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. So let's talk. This is not theological context. Let's just saying a little bit about once they got, I'll go quick. The clock's down for some reason. I didn't realize how late it was. So now I'll go really quickly through the final points, because we'll have some forums later to talk about the history of the colony and its influence. But let's say a little bit. So it took 10 years before they became self-sustaining, turned a profit, and could begin to pay off their investors. Anybody know what ended up being the product that they made money off of?
Tobacco?
No, that was further south. Beaver pelts. Beaver pelts from Maine, and they're trading with the Native Americans in Maine. And interestingly, and I didn't know that until I read this, was my ancestor John Howland, who was in charge of that business for them, who established.
The beaver virtually been extirpated in Europe.
Hmm?
The beaver
Yeah.
virtually been extirpated, and it was the felt industry that was drawing the traders over to the United States, or what became the United States, North America, to trade for the beaver pelts, so that they could make the hats.
Yeah, and the English wanted to corner this market because the Russians had the market, because that was the only place there were still beaver pelts. But the shipping had to come from Archangel and up, the northern, in the Arctic Ocean, and down around Scandinavia, treacherous voyage. So if they could get a trade of beaver pelts across the Atlantic, that was easier and cheaper. So that's what finally made them a profit.
As a matter of fact, when they began to track out the beavers along the Great Lakes, that's what prompted the French to go south, try to find a way down to what became New Orleans. to look for beaver down in the lower part of North America.
And then eventually further west, because they kept
Yeah.
driving them extinct in different places. So once it became clear that there was going to be a market, that was in 1630 is when the Puritans came with John Winthrop to Boston. And so this was a different group, right? So the Puritans had remained within the Church of England, thought they could reform it from within. Our English separatists in Plymouth ended up becoming a small group in this wide. So throughout the 1630s, as England was drawing closer and closer to civil war, more and more Puritans and radical Protestants left. So the 1630s was a great migration of radical Protestants from England to New England. And the Pilgrims in Plymouth kind of got subsumed within this larger group that was more traditional, more conservative, didn't necessarily have the more radical influences of the Plymouth group. But their ideas did survive, and of course Congregationalism flourished. Connecticut was founded by Congregationalists, then Rhode Island by Baptists who were also Congregationalists. And then for the next couple of centuries, routinely there are debates between more kind of hardcore Calvinists and more liberal groups that take some of these more radical ideas. And you see some of that, in some of the, the Ann Hutchinson controversy, the Roger Williams controversy, some of the others. So, just quickly on the legacy. So, recently I read Vernon Parrington, The Colonial Mind. Parrington was a history professor at OU, won the Pulitzer Prize for this book. He was also OU's football coach in the 1920s. Back when football coaches could be Pulitzer Prize winning historians.
Yeah.
Parrington's a little dated in his views these days, and he hates the Puritans. He thinks they're one of the great evils in American history. But he likes the Pilgrims. He likes the people from Plymouth. And he writes that among the ideas that they brought with them, even though they may not have been the dominant ideas, were liberalism, individualism, egalitarianism, and democracy. And that those ideas then had to fight with their more dogmatic authoritarian theology. And that the history of New England is kind of the fight between the theology and these more liberal sort of political ideas. And of course, fortunately, the more liberal political ideas eventually won out over the dogmatic theology. And so in some sense, the American we kind of laud the American inheritance from this particular congregation. And it's not as clear-cut and simple as kind of the myth we learned in elementary school. But there is some truth to it. Any comment on that?
No.
Well, we're actually out of time. I went really late. Any real quick comments or questions?
Yeah, we just don't.
I actually thought it'd be shorter today. And then my final picture.
Well, thank you for an excellent series. It's very informative.
What would you say is the